It's the week ending Saturday the 2nd of December, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen world leaders gathering in Dubai to talk all things climate at COP28, more than 70 hostages released by Hamas in exchange for Palestinian prisoners, and the death of Cold War diplomat Henry Kissinger at the age of 100. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from The Week magazine, it's assistant editor Leaf Arbuthnot. We also have host of the One Decision podcast, journalist Julia McFarlane, and from Money Week. But how long will it be this time before he mentions his wife? We've got a sweepstake going. It's Guy Anker. Julia, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
How Trump could potentially be challenged by Dick Cheney in heels.
Let's stop talking about the dangers of anti-Semitism and do something about it. You have foreign money going into universities right now from Arab countries and Chinese countries. Don't be surprised that we have pro-Hamas protests on our campuses when that foreign money is going in there. Let's get the foreign money out of our universities. The second thing is, look at all of the foreign bots on social media spreading disinformation, spreading pro-Hamas messaging, spreading anti-Semitism. There's a reason India banned TikTok. There's a reason Nepal banned TikTok. It's because it was causing social disruption.
Republican presidential hopeful Nikki Haley speaking to Fox News on Wednesday, giving them lots of the sort of thing they like to hear, Julia, but that's not why she's in the news this week. What's happened?
Right, I just have to qualify my intro because Dick Cheney in heels is something that one of her contenders, Vivek Ramaswamy, called the former South Carolina governor Nikki Haley in a recent debate. And that is referring to Nikki Haley's very muscular brand of republicanism. Now, Trump, we all remember him. He's still the front runner in the race for the Republican presidential nomination. The elections are happening next year, despite the fact that he is facing a slew of trials. But Nikki Haley has been gathering momentum. And this week, the hugely influential political network founded by the billionaire industrialist brothers, the Koch brothers, they endorsed Nikki Haley. It's really crucial because we're now 7 weeks before the Iowa caucuses begin. They're not the only ones. Ron DeSantis, he is another contender for the race. His biggest donor has switched his support to Donald Trump. So there is a lot of things moving in the race for who will be the Republican nominee next year.
And that's maybe a surprising choice, isn't it, Leaf, for Americans for Prosperity Action? That's what the group are called, isn't it, to have made, arguably, because Nikki Haley is different to a lot of Republican presidential candidates. She's Indian, for a start, and she's a woman.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, the Koch brothers endorsed DeSantis, one of her rivals, before his 2022 re-election as governor. So the Kochs have flirted with DeSantis before, so I imagine DeSantis was disappointed that he won't be able to benefit from the Kochs' very deep pockets. I mean, Nikki Haley is an interesting candidate. I find her quite robotic when she's actually on TV, but she's got a great story. Her parents are originally from Amritsar in India and emigrated to Canada and then to South Carolina, where she was born. She is married. She's got 2 children. People like to describe her as a moderate candidate, but and she's quite sort of small government in lots of ways. But she's not quite as moderate as sometimes as she's painted. And my suspicion is that the Kochs, like the look of her because partly she is not Trump, and she's also deemed to be quite a good performer, as she has been seen in the debate so far.
Yes. I mean, talking of DeSantis, Guy, it's interesting to see their reaction to this. Their spokesperson, Andrew Romeo, wrote on X, quote, "Every dollar spent on Nikki Haley's candidacy should be reported as an in-kind to the Trump campaign. No one has a stronger record of beating the establishment than Ron DeSantis, and this time will be no different." I mean, obviously that can be read as confidence that their man is going to come second. But it can also be read as bitterness, really, that this move might mean he can't come first. Trump is going to win this now because of this group, this influential group backing Haley.
It's political posturing, isn't it? Which you'd get in a different form regardless who the candidate was and whatever happened. But I think, Interesting hearing you, Leaf, talking about, how moderate is she? Trump is seen as anything but a moderate. He's arguably the most divisive character in the world, arguably. Whoever is running in this race, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how they compare to Trump. The world needs a US president that can bring people together. And Trump had some successes, of course, but by and large didn't bring people together and caused even more divisiveness, as has been well documented.
Julia, how do you think she does compare with Trump? Her critics say, well, she was actually, she was an ambassador to the United Nations under Trump. She's got a lot of the same policies anyway underneath it all, however she presents herself now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because she is one of the Republicans who spent a long time really dancing around Trump's increasing legal jeopardies. And she refused to criticize him for a long part of the race. And I think she eventually started to speak out against her former boss when the classified documents case started. She said that if what was being alleged in the trial was true, then Donald Trump did endanger national security. And some of the other Republican candidates, notably Chris Christie, have been breaking cover and speaking out against Trump. It's just so interesting because the Republican Party is still so in thrall of Trump. But interestingly, he doesn't have a majority of his party officials openly supporting him, apart from a handful of senators. And there's a lot of state officials who've backed him. But he is still so ahead in the polls. I think the latest 538 polls have him and almost 60%. Ron DeSantis is polling at 13%, and Haley right behind Ron DeSantis at just under 10%. But I think what is interesting is a lot of people are waiting to see whether Trump can keep out of jail, because if he does end up behind bars, you may find that a lot of his donors and a lot of his supporters actually start to switch horses later on in the race.
Yes, and it's interesting, isn't it, Leaf? Regardless of what his supporters do, because a lot of them are saying actually that they would carry on voting for him even if he was in jail and he should be president from jail. The point is, the people who aren't quite his supporters but would swing Republican, would they vote for Trump? And the indication appears to be, well, that would be a decisive factor for them. If he was in prison, a genuinely moderate Republican wouldn't feel comfortable voting for him. And so from Biden's point of view, she would be a much more dangerous opponent, wouldn't she?
Well, this is what people say, that, the Democrats are in the uncomfortable position of both really hoping for Trump and also not wanting Trump to actually become the president because of the potential threat that would present to democracy in America. But I don't really actually buy that Nikki Haley would necessarily be a better candidate than Donald Trump, partly because Donald Trump won the 2016 election against all odds, and he has a habit of kind of outperforming expectations, particularly ones that are voiced in the media. And so I'm kind of trying to learn to expect the unexpected from Trump. And also, it just seems that these legal issues have been going on for so long. I think the chances of him literally being in jail by the time, if he's made president, seem to me still quite slim. He's been a real sort of Houdini with all of these trials and sort of legal issues. So I'd be slightly surprised if he was actually signing edicts from some, miserable little cell. But also, we shouldn't overweight Nikki Haley's prospects because she is still quite far behind in the polls.
Julia, this group, Americans for Prosperity Action, it's interesting. I went on their website this morning and they market themselves as a grassroots group. We go around knocking on doors, we call people for your candidate. And I was kind of thinking, in the UK, that just wouldn't fly, would it? You have pressure groups that are represented by rich people, but why would a normal person, someone who isn't a billionaire, want to support a group that wants anti-union legislation and more tax breaks for the wealthy? What's in it for them?
So I went to this briefing at the Foreign Office a couple of years ago, and the then Defense Secretary, Ben Wallace, told, and it was largely American reporters based in London who came to this briefing. It was aimed at North American media. And he had mentioned that his re-election campaign budget was under £10,000, and the whole room was shell-shocked because he was a cabinet minister in the government and his campaign budget was lunchbox money for them. I mean, it's extraordinary. Now, Nikki Haley does have a long way to go, but I think, we've seen a few elections in the US recently, and candidates who've supported Trump have not done very well. Some of his biggest firebrands, like Kari Lake, I think in Arizona, who have been some of the biggest, campaigners for the Stop the Steal, revisiting the old stolen election argument from 2020. The electorate has shown in polls recently that they are not interested in that old argument. And there was a sense perhaps that Ron DeSantis, who had a more forward-looking platform, could potentially swing into a position to challenge Trump. That was before shortly after the midterms, where he did very well. But he has stumbled slightly. And I think we shouldn't write off Nikki Haley, because one thing that she has got is she has sort of tried and tested authority on the global stage. And if you look at a lot of her campaigning, she has made foreign policy a huge part of her platform, and it is an area where she's strong. She's talked about Ukraine, she's talked about Israel, and Ron DeSantis, Florida governor, doesn't know anything about foreign policy. Vivek Ramaswamy, he knows even less, and he is so isolationist that he thinks that America should dump even its strongest allies like Israel. A lot of the candidates are not that good on policy, where Nikki Haley has a bit more of a track record in talking about these things which are becoming bigger issues for the US in a way they haven't before, namely foreign policy and national security issues.
Yeah, and do you think maybe, Leaf, because of social media, that way in which you can harness a global audience is more important than it used to be? Biden is coming across as senile very often. We've talked about this before on the show. And Trump, as Guy said, is so divisive that I do think there's a thing with Haley that at least she presents as a sort of competent politician, regardless of what you think of the substance of what she's saying.
Yeah, totally. I think also she is a woman, and obviously, famously, the US has never had a female president. I can imagine, normal voters in the US who aren't really paying very much attention to politics, kind of being a bit soothed by this, like nice seeming woman. She doesn't present as someone who's got extreme views, even if, she might have quite extreme views when you actually scratch beneath the surface.
In the recent elections a few months ago, where there were lots of state level elections, abortion rights is turning out to be a much bigger issue for the Republican Party, particularly in places like Ohio. It's becoming a real issue for some of the candidates who are pro-life, as they say. And what Nikki Haley has said about that is she personally is pro-life, but she would not judge people who are pro-choice. And likewise, she would not want to be judged for being pro-life herself. And so she is a bit more palatable for a lot of women, as Leaf was saying. She may not necessarily be moderate, but she is a softer candidate. And the fact that she has a more palatable position on abortion, which basically is that she thinks that it should be left to the states and it shouldn't be a federal issue. And so different states can decide what they want for their abortion laws, which is markedly different from a lot of other Republicans. Ron DeSantis wants abortion to be illegal from 6 weeks onwards, punishable by 5 years in prison for both the woman and the doctor.
Okay. Guy, you're up next after this.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Okay, Guy, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is the leasehold rip-off about to end?
It's finally here. The leasehold and freehold bill has been now published. I shall be spending the next couple of days going through it and scrutinising it line by line. And I look forward to working with the two cities leasehold working group that I have set up with residents from across Westminster and the City of London who've had some really awful experiences as lessees.
Nikki Aiken, MP for Cities of London and Westminster, in a social video she posted on Tuesday, sharing her excitement about a new parliamentary bill. Guy, what is that bill, and is her enthusiasm well placed?
Yeah, so the bill, as she mentioned, it's a leasehold and freehold reform bill. It was introduced to Parliament earlier this week. It's been talked about for years, actually. So We've been waiting a long time for this. And I think, broadly speaking, to answer your question, it's positive. If I explain what's happening. The government is essentially, it doesn't like leasehold. Rishi Sunak has called it a scam in the past. Leaseholds, but you basically own the right to live in a property, but you don't own the land that it's on, and people are subjected to hideous charges. It's very difficult to extend your lease. If you do, it's very costly. The bill is looking to improve some of these positions for leaseholders, making it easier for people to choose who their managing agent is, for example, so they're not hit with unexpected bills, and even managing the property themselves, making it cheaper to extend the lease, making lease extensions, 990 years rather than the 50 or 90 years at the moment. And not in the bill, but really importantly, as part of this discussion, there's a separate consultation on capping ground rents. If you're a leaseholder, you pay a ground rent to the freeholder.
And one of the scandals recently has been around new builds, hasn't it? And that ground rent, which my own sister-in-law got caught up with, actually. She had a new build flat that she bought like 5-6 years ago and then was just about to sell it and was in a property chain. And then the solicitors representing the buyers said, oh no, we're not going to go through with this transaction because we've realised that the ground rent could go up wildly in the next few years. There was no protection for her. It went up, by hundreds of pounds suddenly. That feels like a system that just should not be allowed to exist.
It's unbelievable, isn't it? They used to call it peppercorn rent because you paid nothing for the rent, because what are you getting from it? You're not getting anything. The way it works is the freeholder is the landlord who owns the land. The leaseholder has a lease, say for 100, 1,000 years, depending on the lease, which gives them the right to occupy that particular apartment, or in some cases houses, on that land for that period of time. And you pay what should be a small amount of rent, but in some cases it's hundreds of pounds.
Yeah, it should basically be an admin fee, right? I mean, that's all that's involved, is 20 quid a year for someone to update a document.
Yeah, and this is what they're consulting on. What does this fee look like in the future? Is it peppercorn, i.e. very little? Is it a percentage of the value of the property? Is it just never moves from where it is now, so over time it goes down in real terms because it doesn't go up as inflation goes up? There's lots of things they're consulting on. That is not the ground rent issue is not part of the bill we're talking about today, but is part of the overall discussion around leasehold.
Yes, and another thing that the Times exposed this week, Leaf, that isn't part of the bill as it goes through Parliament this week, is stopping the sale of leasehold flats and houses, which is the thing that ministers have been talking up for 6 years. That's not part of it, actually.
It's a story that makes you want to bang your head against a wall repeatedly. But basically, Michael Gove's sort of flagship bill was to end leaseholds on newly built houses in England and Wales. But when the bill was actually presented this week, Labour noticed very quickly, and it was reported in the Times and in the Guardian as well, that the bill wasn't to end leaseholds on newly built houses in England and Wales, wasn't actually in it. So there's a question about when this is going to be introduced. It might be sort of tagged on as an amendment later on in the process. But for people who really care about this issue, it's irritating because it's just kicking the can further down the road. One thing to sort of emphasize is that the proportion of new build houses, because this applies to new build houses that are sold as leaseholds, has fallen loads. So it was at a 15% high in 2016, and in December 2022 it was just 1%. So there's actually a very small number of houses that are sold as leaseholds in the first place. This is one of my criticisms of this whole sort of the bill and the conversation around it, which is that it's actually it's such small fry. It's not dealing with people who are on leaseholds that are onerous and unfair, or on flats, and loads of flats are leaseholds, and so it's not ambitious enough in my view.
But it does allow people to extend their leases by 990 years instead of 90. So that would help people.
That would help a lot. Yeah.
It would help all their future generations also be trapped in the same lease for 1,000 years. Julia, I know you've got some personal experience of problems around leasehold properties.
Well, certainly not compared to some of the horror stories that you hear where people are trapped in really abusive and exploitative situations by bad freeholders. But I'm in a funny situation of being a share of freeholder with my flat, where the freeholder is a management company owned by the three people who own the flats in the building. And one thing that is interesting about whether you have a leasehold or a freehold is that when you are a freeholder, obviously you're responsible for a lot of the works and maintenance and things like that. And actually in Scotland, where I'm from, there's no such thing as freehold or leasehold. You buy a house, you own your house. There's none of this nonsense about having to lease it and all this kind of stuff. When I first moved to London, I had to learn about leaseholds and freeholds. I was absolutely shocked at this old feudal system still being a part of it. But the Scottish government, they abolished freeholds in 2012. And what's been quite interesting, actually, is a lot of chartered surveyors and people in the industry say that actually one of the sort of unintended consequences of this is that it has reduced the quality of housing stock, because by removing professional freeholders, this is the term described by a lot of these conveyancers, it has put the responsibility of maintenance and all this kind of thing in the hands of people who own properties. And a lot of the time, those maintenance and repairs things aren't done. And I mean, in my flat, we have got maintenance and things that we have to do, and we haven't because we're all broke at the moment. And so, I can understand that a lot of people who are living in these old, Victorian or even older houses are sort of plugging leaks with putty and things because they're trying to make ends meet. But it is something that is a problem. And there was a recent report by Risks, which is the main conveyancing regulatory body, back in 2019. They found that around 60% of all flats need repair in Scotland, and that the private housing stock is deteriorating rapidly, it says. So freehold, leasehold is probably the worst thing that the French ever gave us, thanks to William the Conqueror and the feudal system that he installed back in the day. But it's not as simple as abolishing the system and things all being dandy afterwards. There are complications with it.
That's really interesting, isn't it, Guy? I've never actually heard an argument in favour of leaseholds before, but maybe
I wasn't arguing
a germ of an argument there. Well, it had something there, didn't it?
Passionate advocate of leaseholds.
No.
And yet there is political consensus, really, isn't there? Certainly between Conservative and Labour to abolish leaseholds ultimately.
Yeah, but I think Julian's got a good point. Listen, I'm not a supporter of leasehold. I'm also a leaseholder myself as well.
Me neither.
But there are very few things that are completely black and white, and I think this is another example of them. A well-run lease is not a terrible thing. I think I'm in a block of flats. I think we're well run. The management company essentially devolves responsibility to a group of directors who are friends of mine who live in the building, and they're great. Our costs are under control. We've got our cladding. I've mentioned this before on the podcast. Our cladding's being replaced with one of the homes that what has to be done. It's all being paid for by the government or the developer. Who knows who ultimately foots the bill? But that's because we've gone through a very good process because of the way we're run. And the other potential benefit, and I benefit with very, very small lowercase b of leasehold as well, is, as Julia says, when big things happen, they're more likely to get done. And in the cladding situation, as an example, ultimately the law's been changed. So in many cases, the freeholder is responsible, not the leaseholder. So there are some protections around leasehold. However, there are so many abuses with leasehold. We've got to be really clear here. I personally think the bill, I know Leaf said it doesn't potentially go far enough, which I think is right, but I do think it's a step in the right direction because they are addressing some of the most important issues. And again, I speak as a leaseholder and as a journalist in the industry, so I've got both perspectives. They are addressing cost, the extension of leases, which can be a nightmare, dodgy managing agents. It remains to be seen whether, it's just a bill at this stage, when it becomes an act, how then it actually plays out. But it's, in my opinion, it's a step in the right direction. But there's so much more to do, just to be really clear. It's not a black and white situation.
I mean, the thing is, Leaf, it's complicated, as Guy is saying, and maybe it's just not a complication we want particularly younger people to have to deal with when they're first-time buyers. I mean, the whole property market is trying to move to accommodate younger people getting a foot on the property ladder, and it's that segment, isn't it, who are typically buying flats. 70% of leasehold properties are flats. Yeah, totally.
I mean, if I had my way, I would. This is just the start of the reforms I would bring into the sort of property sector. I think in Portugal, if you buy a flat, it's so much quicker you just kind of there's no kind of, exchanging sort of like endless sort of legal months long delays and things. And I think that the way that we do it in England is just insane. And it should be simplified. And I think there's quite a lot of, possibly some sort of lobbying power against changing these things, because there are a lot of estate agents and people in that sort of chain that rely for their employment on this being a really complicated and expensive process. But
and everything being written in letters for some reason.
Yeah,
like an email won't do.
It's totally ridiculous. It should be like buying a car or something like that. And I know houses are expensive and they usually absorb people's life savings, but it drives me insane how complicated this process is. And as you say, for first-time buyers and also for downsizers, we need downsizers to sort of, be more incentivized to actually jump in and, sell their enormous house to make room for families that want to buy that enormous house. So there are all sorts of, this is just the start of the reforms that I, as president of the world, would impose on the UK.
I mean, Guy, just finally on this, with your sort of personal finance hat on, if you're just about to buy a property or you're looking for properties at the moment, or you're selling your property with a leasehold, how will this affect you, or what should you be looking out for?
Let's look at the buyer and the seller. If you're a seller, I think you're thinking, oh, this might be quite good, because leasehold has been unattractive for some of the reasons mentioned. This potentially, if things go to plan, removes some of that unattractiveness. So there is the potential that it'll make it easier to sell, which might even put the price up. Now, for a buyer, I think it's also good, because while they might be paying a bit more, they can buy a property, again, if things go to plan, with more protection. So I think it's a positive move to the housing market. Something I didn't say earlier, though, which I just want to mention, while I was giving the pros and cons of leasehold, and I'm saying it's not black and white, I think I'm mainly talking about leasehold flats. I think leasehold houses are a sham, because you're living on the land exclusively that you own, and there shouldn't be a leasehold situation. That's why the government wants to ban leasehold on new houses as opposed to flats. On flats, that's where they become grey. There's some good and there's some bad.
Okay. Leaf, you're up next after this. Okay, Leaf, so you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The death of the funeral.
Earlier this year, my mother died. Although her death was expected, I was still surprised by the complex feelings that came up and the unforeseen ways I found myself responding to her loss. Everyone has to face deaths of people they love. And all of us, in different ways, wrestle with the fact of our own mortality.
Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, reflecting on death in a video he posted to his social media on Thursday. Leaf, why was he talking about this?
Well, there was a study that was published just now by a Theos, which is a religion think tank, which has basically warned that funerals are becoming less kind of popular, attractive in the UK. This report asked more than 2,500 people whether they wanted some kind of funeral service or ceremony to be held for them after their death. 47% responded yes, but more than half said they didn't want one or weren't sure. So 24% said no, and 28% said they didn't know.
Hold on, just forgive my ignorance for a minute, but what are the alternatives? I mean, there's a body, something has to happen to it, doesn't it?
Yes, well, so there are things like celebrations of life. That's quite a popular alternative. I think that's basically a sort of bit of a hippie way of describing a funeral. But,
exactly. Well, how is that not a funeral? Is it to do with literally the cadaver not being in the room? What's the...
No. I think that's just a question of how you describe it. But in terms of what the survey has, looked at, that would be included, because they asked, whether they wanted some kind of funeral service or ceremony.
So what is the alternative then? What's the... I mean... The people who say they're not sure if they want a funeral or they don't want one, what is it that they want then, do you think?
I think they want absolutely nothing. So I speak from personal experience. My own grandmother, I have two grandmothers who've died. One of them died 2 weeks ago, and she was, that's all right, but she was 104, and we are having both a funeral on one day and a burial on another day. Then my other grandmother, who died in 2016, she didn't want anything. So literally, I didn't even go. There was no kind of burial. There was a cremation. The argument is from Justin Welby and from other people who are either religious or not, is that if we dispense with a funeral, we are at risk of forgetting how to grieve for people and forgetting how to celebrate a life that has come to an end. So that's why I'm interested in the story, because I think it's it's a sign of the times, but it's also possibly a bit of a worrying development.
And just to take religion out of it for a second, Julia, that's true, isn't it? That traditions, religious and cultural, passed down through generations, have responded to human beings' psychological need for grief and bereavement by creating these ceremonies. And that remains part of our makeup. We need to do something when someone dies.
I think that's true, but you gave me such a great idea when you used the word cadaver. I'm thinking, ooh, maybe I could donate my body to science and then we won't have to pay a thing in terms of getting rid of me after I've popped my clogs. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I think in this country we have quite a funny relationship with death. And I was talking to my partner about this morning, and he reminded me that, back in the Victorian times and older, people would wear mourning clothes for like a year after someone died, even though we did sort of dispatch of people pretty quickly with the funeral. Afterwards, we would stay in mourning for a really long time. I mean, my mother's side of the family is from Indonesia, and in the part of the country where she's from, it's quite traditional to mummify your relatives and keep them all in a little hut in the garden so that they can all be stacked up, so you can visit them when you want. That's how they do things in some of the tribes in Indonesia. The other thing that I think is particularly cogent right now is these things are so expensive. And I think a lot of people find it hard to stomach a bill of, let's say, anything from £3,000 or £9,000, which is what average costs of funerals tend to be when you have, the average cost of a professional funeral that includes a private wake, a funeral party and flowers and things is now £9,200, which is up 4%, or the average cost of a basic funeral, which is just under £4,000. I mean, that's a lot of money for people to deal with. I think the other thing that's also really interesting is that the number of funeral firms has apparently dropped dramatically because of new regulations, because in the last couple of years, this whole industry, before then it was totally unregulated, and there were lots of predatory practices. There were old people and vulnerable people who were subjected to, pressure sales, cold calling, things like that. And so the government recently brought in these reforms, which led to quite a lot of firms collapsing.
Guy, you were nodding vigorously during a lot of that. How much of this do you think comes down to cost and regulation?
Well, cost is a big thing, and I suspect that's why lots of people, going back to the original research, fewer and fewer people wanting to have a funeral. It's thousands of pounds, as Julia says, and that's just for a basic funeral. Some people might want, huge amount of catering, huge bouquets, invite lots of people. It very much depends on the tradition. It might be cultural, it might be family related. This costs so much money. You can buy funeral plans, and I think this is what a lot of the regulation is about, where you can actually personally pay for your own funeral, whether it's a lump sum, whether it's over a significant period of time. As Julia says, though, these were open to abuse. There was mis-selling. There was companies. There was a risk when they weren't regulated. If the company went bust, you lost your money. Fortunately, now from being regulated, there is a lot more protection. But that's one of the reasons why we have seen a lot of companies disappear from the market. But it is just it's a really expensive thing to do. If we just separate the putting the body in the ground or burning it. Sorry to sound so unemotional about it, but just the physical realities of what you have to do when somebody dies, from, let's call it, the ceremony and everything else that goes with it. The first thing you still have to do, of course. It's the second thing. It's the ceremony, the event, whatever you choose to do on top of what needs to be done from a humane and from environmental reasons as well. It's that second half of it. I think that's what people are worried about. They're so worried, especially at this point with the cost of living crisis, in the cost of it all.
And also, just in that first bit of it, if you like, Leaf, there's the risk of, I hesitate to call it upselling, but that's kind of what happens to a lot of families at funeral homes, isn't it? They get there, they're vulnerable, they're in grief, and then they're said, well, there are 20 types of coffin. I wouldn't go for one of the cheaper ones.
Yes, and there is an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm where Larry David chooses an inexpensive coffin, and he gets a lot of grief for it. When people are, when someone you love has died, of course you're probably more vulnerable to being upsold. At the same time, I don't want to sort of portray funeral directors as bad people. It's a job that not many people would choose to do. And in my experience, I haven't been to that many funerals, but I've been to a few. They've been extremely well handled by the people who've been in charge of them. In this survey, it does say that 13% people said they didn't have enough money to afford a funeral, but 67% said that they felt the money could be spent in a better way. So it's not necessarily that people don't have the money. It's possibly that they think that the money should perhaps go to their kids or, be spent on other things. So, the cost is certainly a factor. And for some people, it'll be like, it's literally unaffordable. But for other people, it'll be like, I would rather that the money went elsewhere.
But of course, when you're dead, Julia, and it's not actually your decision anymore, is it? I mean, there's an argument that funerals aren't for you. They're for the people you've left behind.
Yeah, and I there was I don't know if it's nice, but quite a touching story in the BBC looking at how the cost of living crisis was impacting funerals. And it quoted this old lady, Janet Jones, from Norfolk, who's in her 70s. She was interviewed for this article and she had saved for a funeral, but she now has decided that she wants the money to go towards her children going on holiday instead of having a funeral for her. And her children are a bit weirded out by it, but they think it would be quite wrong, and they're sort of trying to get their heads around it. But she's insisting that she doesn't want the money to go towards sticking her in a hole in the ground. She wants something that will make her family feel better, because of course they're the ones who are going to be there and feeling all the pain and all the grief.
So in a sense, should it be your choice, Guy? Or should it be, the reality is often your descendants' choice, isn't it? Because you don't get the deciding vote.
Yeah, especially if you die suddenly, the descendants have to make the decision. No, that just comes down to a family decision, doesn't it? It depends on have you had that conversation in the past, and it's just down to your relationship with the person involved.
But it does come down to what you were saying, which is discussing it. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it, Leaf? To go back to what you were saying about the sort of taboo of death in our culture. If families were more open about it, if people knew what everyone's wishes were, if it was really simple to see on a document, this is what I want, rather than sometimes it's in a will, sometimes it's in a life insurance policy. People are grieving, they don't know where it is. It would be more straightforward. It
would be. I think the pandemic has brought out some conversations about this. I remember very early on in March, my little sister, who was about 25, sending me her will on WhatsApp. So I think, we are possibly having more conversations about it, thanks to our collective brush with mortality. If anything, I would, that this conversation could produce, it would be that people make clear to their relatives what they would like, even if they don't expect to die anytime soon. I would like a funeral, FYI.
Good. You've got it down. You've put it down for posterity. There'll be absolutely no mistakes there. That's it for another edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Leaf, Julia and Guy. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription when you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.